Picture a dog. He's just been caught stealing something off the kitchen counter. Maybe a slice of bread, maybe your entire dinner. You walk in, he sees you, and suddenly he does something strange. He tucks his tail, drops his ears flat, and refuses to make eye contact, turning his whole body slightly away like he's trying to physically erase himself from the room. You probably laughed. You probably called it guilt. But what if that wasn't guilt at all? What if what you were looking at was something far older, far more complex, and far less understood? A shadow of the very same feeling that makes a human want to disappear after tripping in front of a crowd. Scientists have been quietly asking one of the most uncomfortable questions in all of animal behavior. Can animals actually feel embarrassed? And the answer is stranger than anyone expected. For most of scientific history, the idea of animals experiencing what we call self-conscious emotions was dismissed almost immediately. Embarrassment, shame, pride, these were considered uniquely human achievements, built on something animals simply couldn't possess, a sense of self. The reasoning seemed airtight. You can't feel embarrassed unless you know others are watching you and judging you. You can't feel shame unless you have a mental image of what you're supposed to be. These emotions require a kind of inner mirror, a self-aware mind reflecting on its own behavior, and for centuries, the scientific consensus said animals didn't have that mirror. But then researchers started watching more carefully, and the mirror started appearing in the most unexpected places. In 2000, biologist Marc Bekoff published a landmark paper in the journal Bioscience that quietly cracked the foundation of that old consensus. Bekoff had spent years observing animal social behavior, the way wolves play, the way coyotes signal fairness during rough-and-tumble games, the way one animal will deliberately hold back its strength to keep a smaller companion in the game. What he found wasn't just playfulness. It was social awareness. Animals were tracking how they appeared to others. They were modifying their behavior based on the social gaze around them. Bekoff argued that what was being dismissed as simple instinct was actually something much more nuanced. Emotional states shaped by social context, by reputation, by the felt presence of other animals watching and responding. The animals weren't just reacting to the world. They were, in some sense, performing in it. Here's where it gets strange. If animals are performing, adjusting behavior based on an audience, then the next question becomes almost dizzying. Do they know they're being watched? And more importantly, does it matter to them? For decades, the assumption was no. Animals react to threats, to food, to mates. They don't react to social judgment, but that assumption, it was completely wrong. Researchers studying primates began noticing something they couldn't easily explain away. Chimpanzees who failed at a task in front of others behaved differently than chimpanzees who failed alone. In front of an audience, the chimps who stumbled or made errors would sometimes avert their gaze, move away from the group, and show what researchers began calling behavioral inhibition. They weren't just frustrated, they were acting like someone who wanted to be anywhere else in the room. A 2021 comparative study from the University of Amsterdam looked directly at this question, not just in primates, but across species, trying to map which animals showed the building blocks of self-conscious emotion. What they found was a kind of spectrum. At one end, animals with no demonstrated self-recognition, no detectable behavioral change based on social observation. At the other end, great apes, elephants, dolphins, and a handful of corvids, ravens, jays, crows, all of whom showed consistent evidence of self-awareness in mirror tests and showed measurable behavioral shifts when observed by others. The embarrassment-adjacent response wasn't randomly distributed across the animal kingdom. It clustered, specifically and reliably around animals with demonstrated self-recognition. Imagine a raven perching on a branch, tilting its head, examining its own reflection for a full minute. That bird isn't being curious about a stranger. It knows it's looking at itself. And that changes everything about how we interpret what happens next when that same raven makes a mistake in front of its flock. Then came the neuroscience. A 2023 voxel-based meta-analysis published through NIH and PubMed mapped the neural signatures of shame, embarrassment, and guilt in the brain. And the findings pointed to something deeply structural. These emotions don't live in the higher cortical regions alone, the areas most expanded in humans. They are also rooted in the medial prefrontal cortex and the anterior insula, regions with clear evolutionary precursors across mammalian species. In other words, the hardware for shame-adjacent processing isn't exclusively human hardware. It's old hardware. It's shared hardware. It evolved long before our species did. That's the part that stops you cold. These neural structures didn't appear with language or culture. They appeared with social living. Here's the evolutionary shift that made all of this possible and made it necessary. Roughly 50 to 60 million years ago, the ancestors of primates began transitioning from solitary existence to complex group living, fast. Within evolutionary timeframes, this transition was almost sudden, from isolated foragers to tightly bonded social hierarchies, to societies where your survival depended entirely on your standing within a group. What followed was an arms race, not of claws or speed, but of social cognition. Animals who could track their own reputation, who could detect when they had violated a group norm, who could feel something that motivated them to repair relationships and reestablish social bonds, those animals survived. Those who couldn't read the social room, they were excluded, and exclusion in a group-dependent species was death. The IFL Science Review of 2023 put it plainly, embarrassment-like states in social animals aren't accidents of evolution, they appear to serve a function, the same function they serve everywhere else in nature, keeping you in the group. What this reveals about how nature actually works is almost uncomfortable in its elegance. We tend to think of animal behavior in terms of survival mechanics: eat, avoid being eaten, reproduce. But the research on self-conscious emotions points to something layered beneath all of that. Animals are managing their social image. The dog who tucks his tail isn't performing for your benefit. He's responding to a felt sense of social rupture, an internal signal that something in his relationship with you has been disrupted, and that disruption needs to be addressed. The 2025 systematic review published in Frontiers in Psychology argues that self-conscious emotions, shame, guilt, embarrassment, pride, function as social regulators across species. They are the internal enforcement mechanism of group life, not rules handed down from outside, rules felt from within. What if the most powerful force shaping animal behavior isn't hunger or aggression or the drive to reproduce, but something far older and far stranger, the silent, unbearable weight of being watched by those whose opinion of you determines whether you live or die? What if, tens of millions of years before any human felt the heat rise in their face from embarrassment, nature had already solved that problem, and the solution was to make social pain feel real? Go back to that dog in the kitchen, tail tucked, eyes averted, body angled away from you like he's trying to take up less space in the universe. He isn't calculating, he isn't performing. He is, in the most ancient and biological sense of the word, ashamed. Not the way a poet uses that word, the way evolution does. That tucked tail is millions of years of social living compressed into a single gesture, a signal older than language, older than human memory, older than almost anything we think of as feeling. The next time you see an animal flinch from a social mistake, don't laugh at it. You're watching one of the deepest inventions in the history of life on Earth. And it's written, quietly but unmistakably, into the body of nearly every creature that has ever had to live alongside another.